Whispers echo through government corridors. Stories of encounters that were never meant to reach the public. Sealed away in files marked classified. Buried under layers of denial and misdirection. Reports of beings that walk upright like humans, but whose eyes reflect something ancient, something cold-blooded, something that should not exist in our modern world. But here's what most people don't know. The silencing didn't start recently. It's been happening for decades. In the spring of 1978, a small town in the American Southwest became ground zero for an encounter that would set off alarm bells in federal agencies across the country. What happened there, in the span of just 3 nights, would lead to one of the most aggressive cover-up operations the FBI had ever mounted. The witnesses were threatened, the evidence disappeared, and the story, for nearly 40 years, was effectively erased from public memory. Until now. The town itself doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what Deputy Sheriff Marcus Holloway saw on a routine patrol down a stretch of desert highway that had been quiet for as long as anyone could remember. It was approaching midnight when his headlights caught something moving across the road ahead. At first, he thought it was a person, maybe someone whose car had broken down. He slowed his cruiser and reached for his radio. Standard procedure for a potential stranded motorist. But then the figure stopped, right in the middle of the road, and turned to face him. Holloway later told investigators, the ones who arrived before the FBI shut everything down, that what he saw in that moment defied every rational explanation his mind tried to construct. The creature stood upright, roughly 6 feet tall, but its posture was wrong. Too rigid, too perfectly balanced. Its skin caught the headlights in a way that human skin never would, reflecting them back with an almost metallic sheen that suggested scales rather than flesh. The eyes were what broke through his training, his years of remaining calm under pressure. They didn't just reflect the light, they seemed to absorb it, process it, and return something else entirely. A cold, calculating intelligence that made his hands start shaking on the steering wheel. He sat there, frozen, while the thing studied him. That's the word he used later. Studied. Like it was cataloging him, analyzing him, deciding what to do about him. The encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds, but Holloway said it felt like hours. Then, without warning, the creature moved. Not walked, not ran. Moved in a way that his mind struggled to process even as it was happening. It covered the distance from the road to the rocky outcropping, at least 50 yards away, in what seemed like 3 or 4 fluid motions. No human could move like that. No animal he'd ever seen could move like that. And then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness beyond his headlights' reach. Holloway immediately radioed for backup. His voice, preserved in the dispatch recording that somehow escaped destruction, carried a tremor that his colleagues had never heard from him before. 3 other deputies arrived within 15 minutes. They found Holloway sitting in his cruiser, white-knuckled, staring at the spot where the thing had vanished. Here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The deputies searched the area. They found tracks, deep impressions in the sandy soil that didn't match any boot, any shoe, any animal paw they'd ever encountered. 3 toes, each one ending in what appeared to be a claw mark. The stride length suggested something that stood upright but walked with a gait unlike human locomotion. They photographed everything, took plaster casts of the clearest prints, documented the scene exactly as they'd been trained. By dawn, federal agents were on site. They arrived in unmarked vehicles, no badges, no identification, beyond terse statements that they were taking over the investigation. The photographs disappeared into briefcases. The plaster casts were loaded into a van. The deputies were separated and interviewed one by one in a way that felt more like interrogation than cooperation. And then came the visits to their homes. Not threats exactly, more like strong suggestions. Suggestions that what they'd seen could be explained by tricks of light, by desert wildlife, by the stress of night patrol. Suggestions that going public with wild stories about monsters would damage their careers, their credibility, their families' reputations. Suggestions delivered with the kind of calm certainty that made it clear these weren't really suggestions at all. Holloway himself received special attention, multiple visits, long conversations about the importance of public safety, about not causing panic, about the consequences of spreading unverified information. His service record was impeccable, 20 years without a single complaint. But now, suddenly, there were concerns about his judgment, his reliability, his fitness for duty. Concerns that would disappear, he was told, if he simply acknowledged that he'd been mistaken, that stress and fatigue had caused him to misidentify a completely ordinary animal. He refused. For 6 months, he refused. He knew what he'd seen. He knew it wasn't stress, wasn't fatigue, wasn't a trick of the light, but the pressure mounted. His wife started receiving strange phone calls. His children were followed home from school by cars that never quite identified themselves, but never quite went away either. His pension, just 3 years from vesting, suddenly faced bureaucratic complications that seemed designed to make him understand what he stood to lose. In December of 1978, Deputy Marcus Holloway officially retired from law enforcement. The reason given was personal health issues. He moved his family out of state within a month. He never spoke publicly about what he'd seen that night. Not until 2013, when a documentary filmmaker tracked him down through a maze of forwarding addresses and name changes. By then, he was 71 years old, living in a small apartment in Oregon, far from the desert where his encounter had occurred. The filmmaker recorded 3 hours of interviews. Holloway's story never wavered, never contradicted itself, never showed the signs of embellishment or false memory that often plague witness testimony decades after an event. He described the creature in precise detail. He described the federal response with bitter accuracy, and he described something else, something he'd kept to himself, even during those 6 months of resistance. The thing had communicated with him. Not with words, not with sounds, but somehow, in that 30-second span, when they stared at each other across the highway, information had passed between them. A sense of warning, a feeling of territorial assertion, an understanding that he had stumbled into something far older and far stranger than his world was prepared to acknowledge. The documentary never aired. The production company received a cease and desist order, citing national security concerns. The footage was confiscated. The filmmaker's hard drives were seized in a raid justified by completely unrelated tax issues that were later dropped. And Marcus Holloway passed away 4 months later from what the death certificate listed as natural causes, though he'd been in perfect health during the interviews. But that was just the first encounter, the one that established the pattern that would repeat itself across the country over the next 4 decades. 3 years later, in 1981, a wildlife biologist named Sarah Chen was conducting a population survey in the wetlands of Louisiana. She'd spent her career studying reptiles, had handled everything from small garter snakes to massive alligators, and prided herself on her ability to remain calm around even the most dangerous species. Nothing in the swamps frightened her, nothing surprised her, until the night she saw something watching her from the tree line. Chen was camping alone, a practice she'd perfected over years of field work. Her tent was set up on a small rise overlooking a shallow bayou, a spot she'd used several times before without incident. She was reviewing her notes by lamplight when she became aware of a presence. Not a sound, exactly. More like a change in the air pressure, a shift in the ambient noise of the swamp that her subconscious registered before her conscious mind caught up. She looked up from her notebook and saw eyes reflecting her lamplight from perhaps 30 feet away. Her first thought was alligator, but the height was wrong. The eyes were too high off the ground, positioned at a level that suggested something standing upright. Her second thought was bear, but bears were rare this far south, and besides, the spacing of the eyes didn't match. Chen grabbed her flashlight, a powerful LED model designed for spotting wildlife at distance. She aimed it at the tree line and switched it on. What she saw in that beam of light would end her fieldwork forever. The creature stood fully upright, 7 feet tall at least, with a build that mixed human proportion with distinctly reptilian features. Its skin was covered in scales that appeared dark green or brown, though in the artificial light colors were difficult to determine with certainty. The head was elongated, with a pronounced snout that gave it an almost crocodilian profile, but the eyes faced forward like a predator, like a human, with binocular vision that tracked her movements with unsettling precision. It was naked, or at least wore nothing she recognized as clothing. But its stance, the way it held itself, suggested intelligence far beyond animal instinct. One hand, and she was certain later that she could call it a hand despite the claws, rested against a cypress trunk. The gesture looked almost casual, like someone leaning against a wall during a conversation. But there was nothing casual about the way it stared at her. Chen did something that would later seem either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, depending on who told the story. She spoke to it, a simple greeting delivered in the calmest voice she could manage, while her heart hammered against her ribs. The creature tilted its head slightly, a gesture that seemed to indicate it had registered the sound, if not the meaning. Then it took a step forward. That broke the spell. Chen scrambled backward into her tent, fumbling for the radio she kept for emergencies. Her hands shook so badly, she nearly dropped it twice before she managed to key the transmit button and call for help. The park ranger station was 15 miles away. The response time would be at least 30 minutes, but she needed to report what she was seeing, needed to get it on record, needed someone to know what was happening out here. The ranger who took her call tried to calm her down, tried to suggest she was seeing an alligator or possibly a large bird, but Chen cut through the deflections with scientific precision. She described the creature's anatomy, its posture, its apparent intelligence. She was a trained observer. She knew the difference between an animal and something else. And this was something else. The creature remained visible for another 10 minutes. It didn't approach closer, but it didn't retreat either. It simply stood there, watching her tent, occasionally shifting its weight or turning its head to scan the surrounding swamp. Chen stayed on the radio, providing a running commentary of everything she observed, partly for documentation, and partly because talking to another human voice was the only thing keeping her panic at bay. Then, just before the ranger's vehicle arrived, the thing turned and walked into the water, not clumsily, not with the splashing gait of a bear or deer entering a stream. It moved into the bayou with the fluid grace of something perfectly adapted to that environment, and within seconds, it had disappeared. Beneath the dark surface, without a ripple, the ranger found Chen sitting outside her tent, surrounded by her carefully packed equipment, refusing to spend another minute in that camp. She told him everything. He listened with the kind of patient skepticism that suggested he'd heard plenty of strange reports from spooked campers. But his attitude changed when he played back the recording from her emergency call. Chen's voice, captured in real time during the encounter, carried a level of scientific detachment mixed with genuine fear that was difficult to fake. More importantly, something on that recording caught his attention. In the background, barely audible beneath Chen's voice, there was another sound, a low-frequency vocalization that didn't match any animal in his experience. The ranger had worked these swamps for 20 years. He knew every grunt, every bellow, every call that echoed through the wetlands after dark. This wasn't in his catalog. He filed a detailed report, attached the audio recording, noted the witness's credentials, and the unusual nature of her observations. The report went up the chain to the Fish and Wildlife Service. From there, it made its way to a Department of Interior supervisor who flagged it for review by a specialized team that Chen had never heard of, and whose existence wasn't listed in any public directory. Within 48 hours, 2 men in dark suits arrived at Chen's university office. They were polite, almost deferential, as they asked her to recount her experience. They took notes on tablets that never seemed to show what they were typing. They asked detailed questions about the creature's anatomy, its movements, its behavior. They seemed particularly interested in whether it had made any sounds, whether it had attempted to communicate in any way. Chen answered honestly. She was a scientist. If these were federal investigators trying to identify an unknown species, she wanted to help. It was only when they started asking about who else she'd told, who she planned to publish with, what her intentions were regarding public disclosure, that she began to realize this wasn't a scientific inquiry. They were there to make sure she stayed quiet. The conversation shifted, became less friendly. They explained that certain discoveries could pose national security risks, that unknown species in U.S. territory required careful management to prevent panic, to protect both the public and the creatures themselves. They suggested that premature publicity could lead to hunting parties, could endanger an already rare population, could result in the very extinction she presumably wanted to prevent as a conservationist. It was a clever argument. It appealed to her training, her ethics, her commitment to protecting wildlife. And underneath it all was an unspoken threat. She could be on the team that managed this discovery properly, or she could find herself on the outside, facing consequences they didn't need to specify, but made abundantly clear through tone and implication. Chen signed a non-disclosure agreement. She was told the audio recording from her radio call had been classified. She was told that her field notes would need to be submitted for review before any publication. She was told that her career could continue successfully as long as she demonstrated appropriate discretion regarding certain subjects. She left academia within the year, took a position with a pharmaceutical company researching synthetic compounds, never went into the field again. When colleagues asked why such a passionate field biologist had abandoned the work she loved, she gave vague answers about wanting a more stable lifestyle, about the toll of constant travel, about age making it harder to sleep in tents. No one questioned it. People change careers all the time. But sometimes, late at night in her new suburban home, she would stand at the window and think about those eyes watching her from the tree line, about the intelligence behind them, about the questions she'd never get to ask or answer, about the discovery that could have defined her career, but instead ended it. The pattern was becoming clear to those who knew where to look. Credible witness encounters something that shouldn't exist. Evidence is collected. Federal response is swift and comprehensive. Witness is silenced through some combination of persuasion, intimidation, and career consequences. The story disappears from public record, but the encounters kept happening, and each time, someone remembered. Someone refused to completely forget. Someone kept a hidden copy of a photograph, or told a trusted friend, or years later decided the non-disclosure agreement they'd signed no longer mattered because the truth mattered more. In 1996, an Army Ranger named James Rodriguez was conducting a training exercise in the desert mountains of Nevada. Remote terrain, minimal civilian presence, perfect for the kind of intensive navigation and survival drills the Rangers specialized in. Rodriguez had 15 years of military experience, combat deployments, special operations training. He was not a man prone to panic or confusion. His squad was moving through a canyon system at 0300 hours, practicing night navigation without electronic aids. Rodriguez was on point, leading the formation through terrain they'd memorized during daylight reconnaissance. He knew every boulder, every rise, every potential hazard along their route, which is why he immediately noticed something wrong. There was a figure ahead, perhaps 200 yards distant, moving along the canyon wall in a way that suggested climbing, without equipment. No ropes, no harness, just hands and feet finding purchase on rock face that Rodriguez knew for certain was too steep and too smooth for unaided climbing. He signaled a halt and raised his night vision goggles for a better look. What he saw made him question whether his equipment was malfunctioning. The figure was definitely humanoid in overall shape, but wrong in ways his brain struggled to process, even with enhanced vision. It moved with a fluidity that suggested joints bending in directions human anatomy didn't allow. Its skin or covering seemed to shift texture, adapting to the rock surface in a way that looked more like active camouflage than clothing. Rodriguez had trained for every conceivable threat: enemy combatants, hostile wildlife, environmental hazards, but nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for something that moved like this, that climbed like this, that simply shouldn't exist according to everything he knew about the natural world. He watched it for perhaps 2 minutes, tracking its progress along the canyon wall before it reached a ledge and paused. Then it turned, even from 200 yards away, even through night vision that rendered everything in shades of green. Rodriguez felt certain that the thing was looking directly at him. Not at the general area where his squad waited, directly at him, as if it could pinpoint his exact location, despite the darkness, despite their camouflage, despite their training in remaining undetected. The staring contest lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then the creature simply dropped from the ledge, a fall of at least 40 feet onto rocky ground that should have resulted in broken bones at minimum. Rodriguez heard the impact, a solid thump that confirmed this was real and not some hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation. But instead of staying down or limping away injured, the thing landed in a crouch and then sprinted into the deeper shadows of the canyon with speed that seemed impossible for something that size. Rodriguez immediately reported the contact to his commanding officer. His training demanded it. Unknown presence in the training area, possible security breach. The entire exercise was called off. The squad was extracted, and within hours, Rodriguez found himself in a debriefing that felt more like an interrogation. The officers conducting the debrief weren't his normal chain of command. They wore uniforms with unit patches he didn't recognize. They asked questions that seemed designed to catch him in contradictions, to expose exaggeration or fabrication. They showed him wildlife photos, asking if what he'd seen could have been a mountain lion, a bear, even a particularly large iguana somehow displaced from its natural habitat. He refused to play along. He knew what he'd seen. His night vision equipment had been functioning perfectly. His mental state was sound. His squad members, though they hadn't seen the creature as clearly from their positions, could confirm his unusual behavior and the decision to call off the exercise. Something had been out there, something that didn't belong. The debriefing lasted 6 hours. By the end, Rodriguez was physically and mentally exhausted, a state he suspected was intentional. Tired people made mistakes. Tired people became suggestible. Tired people sometimes agreed to things they wouldn't normally accept just to make the questioning stop. But Rodriguez had survived interrogation, resistance training. He knew the techniques being used on him. And while he was forced to sign statements that his report couldn't be verified and that he might have misidentified common wildlife under unusual conditions, he never actually recanted what he'd seen. He'd simply documented that others hadn't seen it clearly enough to corroborate his specific description. The official record showed an exercise terminated due to possible wildlife encounter. Species unconfirmed. No further action required. Rodriguez remained in service for another 8 years, retiring with full honors. But he never participated in another training exercise in that particular mountain range, and requests to return to the site to look for evidence were consistently denied for reasons that always seemed to shift. Something lives in those mountains. Rodriguez remained certain of that for the rest of his life. Something that can climb sheer rock faces, survive falls that would kill a human, and move with speed and intelligence that suggests it's been avoiding detection for a very long time. And someone in the government knows about it and has decided the public doesn't need to know. These 3 encounters, spanning different decades and different geographic regions, establish a pattern. But they're just the beginning. The witnesses we've heard from so far at least lived to tell their stories, even if those stories were suppressed. What happened next would prove that some encounters don't end with just silence. They end with disappearances that are never explained. The thing about government cover-ups is that they require infrastructure, people, resources, protocols that get activated whenever certain keywords appear in certain reports. And that infrastructure leaves traces, even when it's designed not to. Even when everyone involved believes they're protecting national security or preventing mass panic, or whatever justification helps them sleep at night. A former NSA analyst named Patricia Vance spent 3 years piecing together those traces. She wasn't looking for reptilian humanoids. She was investigating patterns in classified document requests, trying to understand how information flows through the intelligence community. But she kept finding anomalies, reports that got flagged and buried, witness testimonies that disappeared from databases, investigation files that showed signs of being sanitized, stripped of specific details while maintaining just enough content to avoid looking completely redacted. The pattern she discovered was striking. Every 18 to 24 months, somewhere in the United States, a report would surface involving a humanoid creature with reptilian characteristics. The location would vary. The witnesses would come from different backgrounds. But the response was always the same: rapid federal intervention, evidence collection, and suppression. Witness management that ranged from gentle persuasion to career destruction. Vance compiled her findings into a report that she never intended to make public. She simply wanted to understand what she was seeing, to map the system she'd stumbled across. But someone noticed her unusual database queries. Someone saw that she was connecting dots that were supposed to remain scattered, and that someone decided Patricia Vance had become a problem. She was called into a meeting with her supervisor and 2 men she'd never seen before. They explained that she'd inadvertently accessed compartmentalized information related to ongoing security operations. They said her research, however well-intentioned, was interfering with classified programs that she didn't have clearance to know about. They offered her a choice: sign an expanded non-disclosure agreement, accept a generous early retirement package, and never speak about what she'd found, or face prosecution under the Espionage Act for mishandling classified information. Vance was 53 years old. She had a daughter in college and a mortgage. She'd spent her career following the rules, respecting classification levels, understanding that some secrets needed to remain secret. But this felt different. This felt like truth being suppressed, not because it would compromise operations or endanger lives, but because it would shatter fundamental assumptions about reality itself. She took the retirement package. She signed the papers. She walked out of that building knowing she'd just agreed to help maintain a lie, but she also walked out with something they didn't know about, a backup drive hidden in her car containing copies of everything she'd found. Insurance, she told herself, just in case they decided silence wasn't enough, just in case her retirement turned into something more permanent. 3 months later, Patricia Vance went hiking in the Appalachian Mountains. She was an experienced hiker. She'd done this trail dozens of times. She had proper equipment, filed a detailed route plan with the Park Service, and maintained regular check-ins via satellite communicator. Until she didn't. Her last check-in came at 2:15 in the afternoon. Everything normal. Weather clear. No issues. Then silence. Search and rescue teams found her car at the trailhead, found her equipment perfectly organized in her pack, as if she'd stopped for a rest and simply decided to walk away from everything. But they never found her. The official report listed her as a missing hiker, probably fell victim to some accident in the wilderness. Animals could have scattered the remains. The terrain was rugged. These things happened, but her daughter knew her mother, knew she was too careful, too experienced, too systematic to just vanish. And when she went through her mother's possessions, trying to find some closure, she found a note hidden in a book. The note didn't explain everything. It couldn't. Patricia had been careful even in her personal records, but it said enough. It mentioned patterns. It mentioned reptilian encounters. It mentioned pressure from unnamed agencies. And it included instructions for accessing a backup drive that her daughter didn't know existed, hidden in a place only the two of them would understand. That drive contained Patricia Vance's research. Every report she'd found, every pattern she'd mapped, every connection between sightings and subsequent cover-ups. It was comprehensive. It was damning. And it was why Patricia Vance disappeared into the mountains and never came back. Her daughter kept the drive hidden for 11 years. She wanted to release it, wanted her mother's work to mean something, but she also wanted to live. She got married, had children, built a quiet life that never attracted attention from federal agencies or mysterious men in dark suits. But she never forgot what was on that drive, never stopped thinking about what it represented. Then in 2018, a secure, anonymous publication platform launched, designed specifically for whistleblowers who needed absolute protection. The technology was solid, the encryption was military grade, and most importantly, it had successfully protected several high-profile leakers from identification. Patricia Vance's daughter decided it was time. The dump went live on a Tuesday morning, 47 documents, hundreds of pages of analysis, internal memos discussing containment protocols for encounters with unidentified humanoid entities, budget allocations for programs that didn't officially exist, and a map showing every reported reptilian humanoid sighting in the continental United States over a 40-year period. The map was the most striking element. Dozens of dots scattered across the country, but not randomly. They clustered. Certain regions showed repeated sightings over decades, remote areas where federal land management provided easy cover for restricted access, places where witnesses could be managed quietly, where evidence could be controlled, where the truth could be buried under layers of bureaucracy and classification. The mainstream media ignored it. Conspiracy theory sites picked it up for a few days, then moved on to newer sensations. The platform itself suffered a massive cyber attack within 72 hours, forcing it offline for weeks. When it came back, Patricia Vance's files were gone, scrubbed from the servers by hackers whose identity was never determined, but whose sophistication suggested state-level resources. But the internet doesn't forget completely. Copies had been made, downloaded, passed through encrypted channels to researchers and journalists who understood what they were looking at. The information was out there now, scattered and difficult to verify, but impossible to completely suppress. And that map showing those clusters of sightings started to attract attention from people who lived in those areas, people who had their own stories, their own encounters, their own moments of witnessing something that shouldn't exist and then being told to forget it, to doubt themselves, to accept that they'd been mistaken. Suddenly they realized they weren't alone, weren't crazy, weren't the only ones who'd seen something the government desperately wanted to remain hidden. The fourth encounter we need to examine happened in one of those cluster zones, a stretch of coastline in the Pacific Northwest where sightings had been reported every few years since the 1960s, where local fishermen told stories about things in the water that weren't seals, weren't sea lions, weren't any marine mammal in the textbooks, things that sometimes came ashore at night and left tracks that the morning tide would wash away. In 2004, a marine biologist named Dr. Thomas Chen, no relation to Sarah, was conducting research on coastal ecosystem changes. His work involved extensive night observation, using infrared cameras to track nocturnal marine activity without disturbing the animals with visible light. He'd been at it for 3 months, collecting data that was completely routine, completely unremarkable, until the night his cameras caught something emerging from the surf. The infrared footage was crystal clear. That was the problem. If it had been grainy, ambiguous, open to interpretation, Dr. Chen might have dismissed it as equipment malfunction or unusual marine life behavior. But the thermal imaging captured every detail with scientific precision: temperature gradients, movement patterns, body structure that registered as warm-blooded despite emerging from frigid Pacific waters. The figure walked upright from the surf line across 50 yards of beach. Its gait was purposeful, almost casual, like someone taking an evening stroll, rather than something that had just spent unknown time in the ocean. The thermal signature showed a core body temperature that shifted as Chen watched, adapting from the cold of the water to the ambient air temperature in a way that suggested active thermoregulation, far more sophisticated than anything in the known animal kingdom. Chen watched the footage 3 times that first night, trying to find a rational explanation. Marine mammal, maybe a seal, exhibiting unusual behavior, but seals didn't walk upright, didn't maintain that posture for extended periods, didn't move with that degree of coordination and apparent intelligence. Person in a wetsuit was his next thought, but the thermal imaging would have shown the insulation layer, would have revealed equipment that simply wasn't there. The creature, and Chen's scientific mind resisted that word but found no better alternative, paused at the high tide line. It turned to look back at the ocean, and even in infrared, Chen could see the profile wasn't human. The skull structure was wrong. Too elongated, too narrow through the temporal region. The jaw protruded slightly, giving it an almost saurian appearance that matched nothing in human anatomy. Then it continued up the beach toward the dune line and the coastal forest beyond. Chen's cameras tracked it for another 200 yards before the tree cover became too dense for clear imaging. It moved the entire distance with confidence, never stumbling, never hesitating, like something intimately familiar with this terrain, like something that had made this journey before. Chen spent the next hour reviewing all his footage from the previous 3 months. He found 2 other instances of similar figures, both occurring on nights with no moon, when the beach would have been pitch black to human eyes. One showed a creature entering the water rather than emerging. The other captured what appeared to be two figures meeting at the surf line, standing together for perhaps 5 minutes before separating, one heading inland while the other returned to the ocean. By dawn, Chen had made several decisions. First, he wouldn't report this immediately to his university or his research sponsors. He needed more data, more documentation, more evidence that could withstand the inevitable skepticism. Second, he would upgrade his camera system, add more units to cover gaps in his current surveillance. Third, he would continue his regular research as if nothing had changed, maintaining the routine that had allowed him to capture this footage in the first place. What he didn't know was that his camera system, which he'd purchased through a government surplus auction, still had active monitoring protocols embedded in its firmware, protocols that flagged certain patterns of thermal imagery and reported them to a server maintained by an agency Chen had never heard of. Protocols that had just sent an automated alert about anomalous humanoid activity captured on coastal surveillance equipment. 3 days later, 2 park rangers knocked on the door of Chen's research station. They were polite, professional, expressing concern that his long-term presence in the area might be disturbing sensitive wildlife habitat. They suggested he might want to consider relocating his study to a different section of coastline, perhaps somewhere with easier access and better facilities. They made it sound like helpful advice, like they had his best interests in mind. Chen thanked them for their concern, but explained that his research specifically required this location due to unique ecological features he'd been documenting. The rangers nodded, seemed to accept his explanation, and left. But Chen noticed they spent considerable time examining his camera setup, asking detailed questions about its capabilities, its coverage area, its recording protocols. Questions that seemed more interested in what he might have captured than in any potential impact on wildlife. That night, Chen copied all his footage to multiple encrypted drives. He sent one to a trusted colleague at another university with instructions to open it only if Chen failed to check in for more than a week. He mailed another to his sister using a shipping service that didn't require identification. He buried a third in a waterproof container in the forest, marking the location with coordinates only he would understand. Insurance, just like Patricia Vance had tried to create. Backup plans against the silencing he was beginning to suspect was coming. The Rangers returned 4 days later. This time, they weren't alone. 2 men in civilian clothes accompanied them, carrying credentials that identified them as environmental protection specialists conducting a routine survey. They wanted to review Chen's research data, they said, standard procedure for long-term studies in protected areas. Nothing to worry about. Chen showed them his official research data, water temperature readings, tidal patterns, marine vegetation surveys, everything that constituted his legitimate work. They seemed satisfied, but then one of the civilians asked about his camera system. Had he noticed any unusual activity? Any unexpected wildlife behavior? Anything that didn't fit normal patterns? This was the moment Chen had to decide. Tell the truth and risk everything, or lie, and hope they didn't already know what his cameras had captured. He thought about Marcus Holloway's destroyed career, about Sarah Chen's forced exit from fieldwork, about Patricia Vance disappearing into the mountains. He thought about the pattern of silencing that had been operating for decades. He lied, said the cameras had captured nothing unusual, just the expected nocturnal activity of known species. Seals, sea lions, occasional deer from the forest, routine observations that confirmed what the scientific literature already documented about coastal ecosystems. The civilian studied him for a long moment, then smiled in a way that suggested he knew Chen was lying, but appreciated the effort. They thanked him for his cooperation, reminded him that if he did happen to observe anything unusual, anything at all, there were proper channels for reporting it. Channels that would ensure appropriate expert review. Channels that would protect him from any potential embarrassment if his observations turned out to be mistaken. Then they left, taking with them the hard drives from his camera system. Standard procedure, they said. The footage would be reviewed as part of the environmental survey and returned within a few weeks. Chen knew he'd never see those drives again, but he also knew they only had copies of his routine research footage. The infrared recordings of the creatures were safe on his encrypted backup drives. For 2 months, Chen continued his research and his covert surveillance. The creatures appeared 7 more times. He documented everything: their movements, their behavior patterns, their apparent comfort in this environment. He even managed to capture audio on one occasion, a series of clicking sounds that suggested communication between 2 individuals moving together along the beach. But he also noticed something else: increased patrol activity in the area, Park Service vehicles passing by his research station more frequently than necessary, hikers who seemed more interested in photographing his equipment than the scenery, a subtle but unmistakable increase in surveillance that told him his lie hadn't been believed after all. In November of 2004, Dr. Thomas Chen packed up his research station and left the Pacific Northwest. He cited budget constraints and academic pressures requiring him to return to campus. He filed his final reports documenting routine coastal ecosystem observations. He published a paper on tidal effects on marine vegetation that was thoroughly unremarkable and attracted no attention whatsoever. He never went back to field research, spent the rest of his career in university laboratories, studying samples other people collected. He kept the encrypted drives hidden in a safe deposit box under a false name, insurance he hoped he'd never need to cash in. And he lived with the knowledge that something remarkable existed on the Pacific coast, something that walked between the ocean and the land, something that had been systematically hidden from public knowledge for longer than he'd been alive. The 5th encounter, the one that brings all these threads together, didn't happen to a scientist or a law enforcement officer or a military professional. It happened to a journalist named Michael Torres in 2017. Torres specialized in investigative reporting about government accountability. He'd broken stories about misuse of classified budgets, about surveillance programs that exceeded their legal authority, about the gap between what agencies claimed they did and what they actually did. He'd been researching a story about unexplained federal expenditures in remote areas when he started noticing patterns similar to what Patricia Vance had found. Money flowing to programs with vague descriptions, personnel assigned to facilities that didn't appear on any official maps, equipment purchases that seemed designed to detect or track something the requisition forms never quite specified. Torres was thorough. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests. He interviewed former employees who'd moved on to private sector jobs and felt comfortable talking. He tracked budget line items through multiple fiscal years, watching how the same core funding got repackaged and relabeled, but never actually disappeared. And slowly, he began to understand that he'd stumbled into something far stranger than routine government waste. The term that kept appearing in the documents he'd obtained was cryptobiological containment. Never explained, never defined, just referenced in ways that assumed everyone reading understood what it meant. Torres didn't understand, but he was determined to find out. His investigation led him to a former park ranger named David Moss, who'd worked in the Pacific Northwest during the same period as Dr. Chen's research. Moss had retired early, citing burnout, but Torres sensed there was more to the story. It took 3 meetings and considerable persuasion before Moss agreed to talk off the record. Moss described a system of protocols that rangers were required to follow when certain types of sightings were reported. reported, protocols that weren't in any official manual, but were passed down through quiet conversations between experienced personnel. If a visitor reported seeing something that fits certain descriptions, humanoid but not quite human, reptilian features, unusual capabilities, the ranger was supposed to file a specific type of incident report using specific coded language. That report would trigger a response from federal specialists who would arrive quickly, interview the witnesses, confiscate any evidence, and ensure the incident was explained away as misidentification of known wildlife. Moss had filed 3 such reports during his career. Each time, the response had been swift and comprehensive. Each time, the witnesses had been convinced or coerced into accepting alternative explanations. Each time, Moss had been reminded that public panic was a serious concern, that unverified reports of unknown creatures could damage tourism and local economies, that protecting people sometimes meant protecting them from information they weren't prepared to handle. Torres asked the obvious question: had Moss ever seen one of these creatures himself? The ranger hesitated, then admitted he had, once, late at night on a remote trail. Something that walked upright and moved with intelligence, but definitely wasn't human. He'd reported it through the proper channels. The specialists had arrived, and he'd been strongly encouraged to consider the incident a result of poor lighting and his own fatigue, rather than an actual encounter with something unknown. But Moss knew what he'd seen. He'd worked in those forests for 20 years. He knew the difference between a bear and something else. He knew the difference between shadows and solid matter. He knew the difference between natural sounds and the clicking communication he'd heard before the creature disappeared into the darkness. And he knew that admitting any of that officially would end his career the same way it had ended careers before his. Armed with this information, Torres continued his investigation. He tracked down other witnesses, found people who'd signed non-disclosure agreements but were willing to talk anonymously, discovered a network of individuals across the country who'd all encountered something similar and had all been silenced through various means. He compiled their testimonies, cross-referenced them with the budget documents he'd obtained, and began building a comprehensive article that would expose the cover-up. He contacted several major newspapers, pitched the story as government waste meets real, unexplained phenomena. Most editors rejected it outright, too controversial, too potentially embarrassing if it turned out to be false. But one editor at a respected national publication saw the potential, assigned additional reporters to verify Torres's sources, started the fact-checking process that would prepare the article for publication. That's when Torres received a visit at his home. 2 men, federal credentials, requesting a conversation about his recent research. They were more direct than the people who'd managed previous witnesses. Perhaps because Torres was a journalist with First Amendment protections, perhaps because they'd learned that subtle approaches didn't always work with people determined to expose the truth. They told him he was investigating matters that touched on national security, that his reporting, however well-intentioned, could damage ongoing operations designed to protect public safety. They showed him classified documents, heavily redacted, but clearly referencing the systematic monitoring and containment of unidentified humanoid entities. They explained that disclosure would create mass panic, would lead to hunting parties entering protected areas, would result in the very extinction of species that federal agencies had been working to preserve. It was a clever argument. Positioned the cover-up as conservation rather than suppression. Framed the secrecy as necessary protection for vulnerable populations, appeal to Torres's presumed environmental sensibilities, and underneath it all, the implicit threat: proceed with publication and face consequences that couldn't be specified, but could certainly be implied. Torres refused to back down. He had sources willing to go on record. He had documents that proved government knowledge and active suppression. He had a constitutional right to publish stories of public interest. The men listened politely, then left. They delivered their message. What Torres chose to do with it was technically his decision. The article ran 2 weeks later, 6,000 words detailing decades of encounters with reptilian humanoids, systematic cover-ups by federal agencies, and evidence that an unknown species existed within United States territory. It named witnesses willing to be identified. It referenced classified documents Torres had obtained. It presented a case that was thorough, well-sourced, and impossible to easily dismiss. The response was immediate, but not what Torres expected. Rather than denial or deflection, the official statement acknowledged that federal agencies maintain protocols for handling reports of unusual wildlife sightings, that some classified programs did involve monitoring of potentially undiscovered species, that concerns about public safety and species protection sometimes required limiting disclosure of sensitive information. It was carefully worded to sound like reasonable conservation policy rather than admission of the existence of reptilian humanoids. Mainstream media coverage focused on government secrecy rather than the creatures themselves. Debates about when classification was justified. Arguments about public right to know versus potential harm from disclosure. The actual subject of Torres's article, the beings that had been encountered and documented, got lost in discussions about government transparency and accountability. Within a month, the story had faded from news cycles, dismissed by many as overblown conspiracy theory, acknowledged by others as revealing problematic government secrecy, but not necessarily proving the existence of unknown creatures. The witnesses who'd agreed to be named found themselves subjected to aggressive skepticism and personal attacks that questioned their credibility, their motives, their mental stability. Torres himself faced no direct retaliation. His career continued. He published other investigations that won awards and recognition. But he never wrote about reptilian humanoids again, not because he was threatened, because he realized that even when the truth was published, even when evidence was presented, even when witnesses came forward, people would find ways to dismiss it, to rationalize it, to file it away as interesting but unproven. The cover-up didn't require active suppression anymore. It maintained itself through public unwillingness to accept that reality might be stranger than comfortable assumptions allowed. But here's what Torres discovered in the years after his article was published. The witnesses he'd interviewed, the ones who went on record despite the risks, started connecting with each other. They formed a quiet network of people who'd seen something that shouldn't exist and refused to pretend otherwise. They shared information about sighting locations, about behavior patterns, about the federal response protocols. They became amateur researchers documenting a phenomenon that official science refused to acknowledge. And they found others, so many others, people who'd never reported their encounters because they knew they wouldn't be believed. People who'd been silenced decades ago and thought they were alone. People who'd captured brief footage on cell phones or trail cameras and didn't know what to do with it. The number of witnesses was far larger than anyone had realized. The encounters were far more frequent. The evidence was far more extensive. What emerged from this underground network was a picture that was both fascinating and disturbing. The creatures, whatever they were, appeared to be intelligent. They avoided contact with humans, but didn't seem hostile. They moved between aquatic and terrestrial environments with ease. They communicated with each other through clicking sounds and possibly other means. They'd been present in North America for far longer than European colonization, possibly for thousands of years, based on Native American oral traditions that described similar beings. Some researchers in the network began calling them the hidden ones. Others preferred more scientific terminology, proposing classification as an undocumented hominid species with reptilian characteristics. But most witnesses just called them what their first instinct suggested: lizard people. Not because that was accurate necessarily, but because no other term captured the fundamental strangeness of beings that looked almost human, but definitively weren't. The government's position never officially changed. Acknowledge monitoring programs for unusual wildlife. Maintain that protection protocols existed for good reasons. Never confirm or deny the specific existence of reptilian humanoids. It was a perfect stance, flexible enough to accommodate whatever evidence might emerge, vague enough to avoid concrete claims that could be disproven, official enough to satisfy requirements for public accountability, while revealing nothing substantive. But the underground network knew better. They had the testimonies, they had the documentation, they had the evidence that had been collected and hidden and leaked over decades. They knew that something remarkable lived alongside humanity in remote corners of North America, something that had managed to remain hidden not through its own efforts alone, but through systematic suppression by authorities who decided the public wasn't ready for this truth. Today, right now, as you listen to this, those creatures are still out there, still moving through coastal forests and desert canyons and remote wetlands, still avoiding contact with most humans, while occasionally being glimpsed by those who venture into the right places at the right times, still being monitored by federal agencies, operating under protocols that acknowledge their existence while denying it to everyone without appropriate clearance. The witnesses from our 5 encounters live with their knowledge. Marcus Holloway took his to the grave, having finally told his story, but never seeing it believed. Sarah Chen left the field she loved, trading discovery for security. James Rodriguez completed his military service knowing something impossible was real. Patricia Vance may have died for trying to expose the pattern. Dr. Thomas Chen keeps his encrypted drives as insurance against a threat that never quite materializes but never quite goes away. And Michael Torres continues his journalism, knowing that sometimes publishing the truth isn't enough to make people accept it. The FBI didn't silence these stories through force alone. They silenced them through a combination of pressure, persuasion, and the cultivation of a cultural environment where extraordinary claims are automatically dismissed regardless of the credentials or credibility of those making them. They silenced them by making witnesses understand that coming forward meant losing more than they would gain. They silenced them by creating a system where even documented evidence could be explained away or classified into invisibility. But silence isn't the same as absence. The creatures exist, whether we acknowledge them or not. The encounters continue, whether they're reported or not. The truth persists, whether it's believed or not. And somewhere, in files marked classified, in database entries coded for special access, in the institutional memory of agencies whose full mandates remain secret, there exists comprehensive documentation of beings that official reality insists cannot exist. The question isn't whether lizard people are real. The witnesses know they are. The question is why, with all this evidence, all these encounters, all these decades of documentation, does the cover-up continue? What would happen if the truth was fully disclosed? What are the authorities really protecting us from? The creatures or the knowledge of them? And how long can a secret this big remain? Hidden in an age when information wants to be free and witnesses refuse to stay silent. Those questions don't have easy answers. Maybe they don't have answers at all, but they're worth asking, worth considering, worth keeping in mind the next time you hear someone dismiss a strange sighting as imagination or misidentification, because sometimes the impossible turns out to be simply the not yet accepted. Sometimes the crazy story turns out to be the uncomfortable truth. And sometimes the cover-up isn't about protecting us from danger. It's about protecting us from having to rebuild our understanding of what's possible in this world we thought we knew completely. The hidden ones remain hidden, not because they're hiding effectively on their own, but because we've been taught not to see them, even when they're standing right in front of us. The FBI and other agencies didn't need to silence every witness. They just needed to silence enough of them that the rest would silence themselves. They just needed to create conditions where speaking up seemed pointless, where evidence would be dismissed, where the price of truth-telling exceeded what most people were willing to pay. That system is still operating, still managing encounters, still suppressing evidence, still ensuring that official reality remains undisturbed by inconvenient facts. But it's also showing cracks. The network of witnesses grows, the documentation accumulates, the questions become harder to deflect, and each new encounter adds another person who knows, who remembers, who refuses to pretend they didn't see what they clearly saw. Maybe one day, the weight of accumulated evidence will become too heavy for the cover-up to support. Maybe one day someone will obtain documentation too comprehensive to be dismissed or classified away. Maybe one day the creatures themselves will make a choice that renders human attempts at secrecy irrelevant. Or maybe the cover-up will continue indefinitely, sustained by institutional inertia and public unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But now you know. You've heard the stories. You've learned about the pattern. You've seen how the silencing operates. What you choose to do with this knowledge is up to you. Dismiss it as entertaining fiction. Consider it as possible truth. Research it yourself and draw your own conclusions. The choice is yours. Just remember this. The next time you're in a remote area late at night, the next time you see something that doesn't quite fit what you expect, the next time your rational mind insists something is impossible, even as your eyes tell you it's real, ask yourself whether you're seeing clearly or whether you've been trained to look away. Ask yourself whether the boundaries of the possible are where you've been told they are. Ask yourself whether the silence around certain subjects exists because there's nothing to discuss, or because something very real has been deliberately hidden. The lizard people encounters that the FBI silenced down aren't just history. They're ongoing, happening right now in places most people never go, witnessed by people who learn quickly that sharing their experience comes with costs most aren't willing to pay. But the truth doesn't disappear just because it's suppressed. It waits, it accumulates, it persists in the memories of those who've seen it, and in the evidence that keeps emerging, despite all efforts to bury it. And somewhere tonight, in a remote corner of North America, someone is having an encounter that will change their understanding of reality forever. An encounter they probably won't report. An encounter that will be silenced not through government intervention, but through their own realization that speaking up would cost them more than staying quiet. An encounter that will become another data point in a pattern that officially doesn't exist, but continues nevertheless. The hidden ones are still hidden, but now you know they're there. The question is what you'll do with that knowledge. Will you add it to the silence, or will you join the quiet network of people who refuse to pretend that comfortable lies are better than uncomfortable truths? The choice, as it always has been, is yours.